The stars outside New Horizons Station sparkled like diamonds, scattered across black velvet, and 10-year-old Danny Martinez pressed his face against the observation window, watching them with wonder in his bright brown eyes while his small robotic dog named Chip beeped happily beside him on the polished metal floor of the corridor that connected the human quarters to the diplomatic gardens, where children from a dozen different alien species played together under the artificial sun that warmed the enclosed biodome at the heart of the station. Danny's mother, Claire, worked long hours in the xenobiology lab, studying the fascinating differences between human genetics and the genetic structures of the galaxy's other intelligent species, and she often told her son that understanding each other's biology was the first step toward true friendship between the stars. And Danny believed her completely because he had friends here who didn't look anything like him, but who laughed and played and dreamed just like any human child back on Earth. The station orbited Keisher Prime, which was a neutral world chosen by the Galactic Council as the perfect location for cultural exchange and diplomatic meetings between humanity and the thousands of alien civilizations that had been traveling between stars for centuries before humans ever left their own solar system, and Admiral Paul Henderson commanded the small fleet of 30 Earth defense ships that protected the station and ensured that humanity's first permanent presence in Council space remained safe and secure. Today was supposed to be a normal day with Danny attending his morning lessons about galactic history and then playing in the gardens with his friends. But everything changed when the massive Krillian warships arrived unannounced, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a formation that made Admiral Henderson immediately order his ships to battle stations, even though he knew his small fleet stood no chance against the military might of the Krillian Empire, which controlled over 400 star systems and fielded the second-largest armada in known space. Counselor Vex Thor emerged from the lead ship, wearing the elaborate armor of a Krillian high noble, and his reptilian features were twisted into an expression of cold anger as he demanded an immediate assembly of all council representatives present at the station, and Claire Martinez was called away from her lab to join the other Earth diplomats in the Grand Chamber, where important decisions were made, and she kissed Danny's forehead and told him to stay in their quarters until she returned. But Danny was 10 years old and curious like all children, and when Chip's ball rolled down the corridor toward the restricted section of the station where the diplomatic meetings were held, Danny chased after it, without thinking about the signs that warned unauthorized personnel to stay away. And he scooped up the blue rubber ball just as his small feet carried him past the threshold into a zone that was supposed to be accessed only by official delegates and their security personnel. The Krillian guards saw the human child first, and their training took over before their minds could process what they were really seeing. And alarms shrieked through the station's corridors as they grabbed Danny by his thin arms, lifting him off the ground while Chip barked electronic warnings and tried to follow, but was kicked aside by a scaled foot that sent the small robot tumbling across the floor, with sparks flying from its damaged casing. Claire heard the alarms and her heart froze in her chest because she knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. And she ran from the diplomatic chamber despite the protests of Ambassador Richard Stone, who tried to call her back, and she found her son being dragged before Counselor Vex Thor in the station's central plaza, where dozens of aliens had gathered to see what the commotion was about. Vex Thor's voice boomed across the plaza as he declared that the human child was obviously a spy sent to infiltrate the restricted diplomatic areas and gather intelligence for Earth's military. And Claire screamed that he was just a boy chasing his toy, and she begged the counselor to show mercy and reason. But Vex Thor's eyes were cold and calculating as he explained that under Krillian law, any breach of diplomatic security was punishable by immediate execution, regardless of the offender's age or apparent innocence. The other council members stood silently watching as Admiral Henderson arrived with a security team and demanded that Danny be released immediately, and he promised to take full responsibility for the breach and ensure proper punishment under human law. But Vex Thor refused and stated that this was a matter of Krillian sovereignty, and the Council Charter clearly stated that each member species had the right to enforce their own laws within designated security zones. Claire fell to her knees, sobbing and pleading, and she offered herself in exchange for her son's life. But Vex Thor ignored her completely, and he gestured to his guards, who drew their plasma pistols and aimed them at the terrified child, who didn't understand what was happening or why all these adults were so angry about him picking up his ball. Danny looked at his mother with confused tears streaming down his face, and he said he was sorry for going where he wasn't supposed to go, and he promised he would never do it again if she would just take him home. And Claire tried to reach him, but the guards held her back, and Admiral Henderson put his hand on his own weapon, but he knew that starting a firefight would get everyone killed and wouldn't save the boy. The execution happened in seconds with plasma fire burning through the small body, before Danny even had time to scream, and Claire's anguished wail echoed through the station's corridors, reaching every human ear and searing itself into their memories forever, while Counselor Vexthor calmly holstered his weapon and declared that justice had been served according to the ancient laws of his people. Ambassador Stone sent an emergency transmission to Earth Command with encrypted video footage of everything that had happened, and within hours, every human world had seen the images of Claire Martinez holding her son's burned body, while aliens stood around them looking uncomfortable but unwilling to condemn what had been done. And the Galactic Council issued an official statement, calling the incident unfortunate, but legally justified under Imperial law, and they expected humanity to accept this judgment as part of the price of joining galactic civilization. Admiral Henderson stayed by Claire's side, as medical personnel gently took Danny's body from her arms, and he made a promise that he recorded and sent directly to Fleet Command on Earth, and his words were simple and cold and absolutely certain when he said that the Galactic Council had made a grave mistake, and that humanity would not forget and would not forgive and would not rest until justice was truly served. The news reached Earth like a shockwave, and billions of humans watched the footage with growing horror and rage, and in government chambers and military headquarters across human space, leaders convened emergency meetings and began accessing files that had been sealed for decades and opening vaults that were never supposed to be opened in peacetime. And the ancient fleet that had slept in darkness for 60 years began to wake. The underground facility beneath the Colorado mountains had been sealed since the end of the Unification Wars, when humanity finally stopped fighting itself and turned its eyes toward the stars with hope instead of fear. And Fleet Admiral Gregory Barnes stood before the massive blast doors of Vault 7 with his hand on the biometric scanner, while President Victoria Hayes watched through a secure video link from the White House and gave the authorization that had been prayed would never be necessary. The doors opened with a groan of metal that had not moved in 6 decades, and the lights inside flickered to life, revealing row after row of massive warships that hung in their docking cradles like sleeping giants, waiting to be awakened. And these were not the sleek exploration vessels that humanity had built after first contact with alien civilizations, but rather the brutal, efficient killing machines that had been designed when humans believed they might face extinction from unknown threats. In the darkness between stars, Chief Engineer Lisa Park had spent her entire 30-year career maintaining these ships in their hibernation, and she walked Admiral Barnes through the cavernous hangar, explaining that every system had been tested monthly and every weapon kept in perfect working order, because the engineers who built Vault 7 had understood that hope was not a strategy, and that peace only lasted as long as those who wished for war believed the cost would be too high. The dreadnoughts were enormous vessels covered in meters-thick armor plating and bristling with weapons that made modern Council warships look like toys, and they carried kinetic kill weapons that fired solid projectiles at incredible speeds and nuclear pulse drives that could accelerate them to velocities that would tear apart any ship designed for elegant energy-based combat, and relativistic missiles that traveled at 90% of light speed and hit with the force of small atomic bombs. Admiral Barnes selected 70 of the best-maintained dreadnoughts and began assembling crews from volunteers who lined up by the thousands wanting to be part of humanity's response to the murder of an innocent child. And among those volunteers was Claire Martinez herself, who had transformed from grieving mother into something cold and hard, and absolutely determined to see justice done no matter what the personal cost. Captain Nathan Cross was given command of the flagship, which the crew immediately named the Vengeance, and he was a veteran of the border skirmishes where human colonists had fought off pirate raiders and protected remote settlements, and he understood that sometimes peace could only be achieved through the credible threat of overwhelming violence, and he accepted the responsibility of carrying that threat to the heart of the Galactic Council. Meanwhile, on Axis Prime, the capital world where the Council maintained its grand chambers and luxurious estates, Ambassador Richard Stone delivered Earth's formal ultimatum, demanding that Counselor Vexthor and the Kralian guards who had killed Danny be surrendered for trial under human law, and that the council issue a formal apology in recognition that what had happened was murder, not justice. The council chamber erupted in laughter when the ultimatum was read aloud, and Counselor Vexthor himself stood to address the assembly, reminding them all that humanity had been in space for barely 70 years, while the youngest council species had been traveling between stars for over 2,000 years, and he suggested that humans were emotional children who did not understand how galactic politics actually worked. The Krylian Empire alone commanded 10,000 warships, and the entire council could field over 50,000 vessels if necessary, while human intelligence suggested that Earth possessed maybe 300 or 400 small cruisers for system defense and exploration, and the mathematical reality was clear. And the council voted to impose economic sanctions on humanity for making hostile threats against a council member species, and gave Earth 1 standard month to withdraw the ultimatum and accept the ruling or face complete isolation from galactic trade and diplomacy. Ambassador Stone listened to the vote in silence, and then he stood and delivered his final message before departing Axis Prime. And his words were calm and measured, but carried a weight that made several council members feel uncomfortable, though they could not explain why. And he said that humanity had spent a century building weapons before they built starships because humans learned long ago that the universe did not reward the weak or protect the innocent, and that the council had killed Earth's child and would now learn what it meant to awaken humanity's capacity for war. The ancient fleet emerged from Earth's solar system through a network of Einstein-Rosen bridges that humanity had built in secret during the past 40 years, folding space itself to allow rapid movement between key strategic points, and the bridges were invisible to council sensors, which relied on detecting the energy signatures of traditional faster-than-light drives, and so the human fleet appeared to simply vanish from Earth and reappear light-years away without any of the telltale signs that council ships produced. Admiral Barnes had designed the fleet's operational doctrine himself, and it was based on a simple principle that had served humanity well throughout its violent history, and that principle was overwhelming force applied with precision and speed, to break the enemy's will to fight before they could organize an effective response. And the first target was carefully chosen to send a message that could not be misunderstood or ignored. Belmark Station was a Krylian military outpost where the guards who had participated in Danny's execution were stationed, and it housed 3,000 personnel and served as a logistics hub for Krylian operations in that sector. And Captain Cross brought the Vengeance within weapons range and ordered all other ships to hold position, because this first strike needed to be a demonstration that the entire galaxy would understand. The relativistic missile launched in complete silence because there is no sound in space, and it accelerated to 90% of light speed in under 30 seconds, and the Krylian defenders had just enough time to detect something coming before impact, and they activated their energy shields, which were designed to disperse plasma bolts and redirect energy beams, but were completely useless against solid matter moving at relativistic speeds. The kinetic impact released energy equivalent to a small nuclear weapon, and the shield generators overloaded instantly, and the missile punched through the station's hull like paper, and the secondary explosions from ruptured reactors and ammunition stores tore Belmark Station apart in a brilliant flash that was visible from 3 neighboring systems, and 3,000 Krylian soldiers died in less than 5 seconds, without ever understanding what had hit them. Captain Jake Morrison, commanding the Retribution, led a strike team to the surface of Krylos Prime, where Counselor Vexthor maintained a fortified estate, protected by energy barriers and automated defense systems, and the human Marines used magnetic, acceleration cannons and old-fashioned explosive breaching charges and tactics that had been developed in the brutal urban combat of Earth's 21st century, and the Krylian defenses were designed to stop energy weapons and organized military assaults, but not small teams of heavily armed soldiers who moved like ghosts and killed with ruthless efficiency. Vexthor was captured alive and brought aboard the Vengeance in chains, and he screamed threats and demanded to know what right humans thought they had to assault a council member. And Captain Cross looked at him with eyes that held no mercy and said that they had the same right that Vexthor had claimed when he murdered a child, and that he would face human justice now whether he accepted it or not. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, and for the first time in over 300 years, they faced an enemy that did not follow their established rules of warfare, and Council Admiral Shendar of the Genkar Collective assembled. a fleet of 800 warships and began moving to intercept the human vessels. And the Council was confident that numerical superiority would quickly end this human tantrum. But Dr. Helen Cooper, who had been a military strategist before becoming the fleet's chief tactical advisor, proposed a plan that was audacious to the point of madness, and she suggested that instead of engaging the Council fleet in open battle, they should jump past them entirely and strike at Axis Prime itself. And Vice Admiral Chris Walker argued that attacking the capital was too aggressive and would turn potential allies against them. But Captain Cross understood that half measures would only prolong the conflict, and he gave the order to execute Cooper's plan. The human fleet appeared in orbit around Axis Prime, and billions of aliens looked up at the sky to see 70 human dreadnoughts hanging there like swords suspended over their heads, and Captain Cross broadcast a message on all frequencies declaring that humanity did not make war on children or civilians, but that the Council government and military installations were legitimate targets, and that justice would be served. The building where the Council had voted to sanction Earth was destroyed in a surgical strike that used conventional explosives rather than relativistic weapons, and 57 Council members died, including many who had voted for sanctions, and the message was clear and unmistakable, and the galaxy watched in shock as humanity demonstrated that nowhere was safe, and that the rules of civilized warfare meant nothing to a species that was fighting for something more important. The galaxy had not seen real war in over 500 years, because the Galactic Council had created a system where conflicts were resolved through economic pressure and political maneuvering, and the occasional limited military action that followed. Strict rules about acceptable targets and proportional responses, and all of that changed the moment 70 human dreadnoughts appeared over Axis Prime, and demonstrated that they were willing to ignore every rule that civilized species had agreed upon. Panic spread through Council space as species that had felt secure under the protection of ancient treaties suddenly realized that humanity possessed both the weapons and the will to strike anywhere at any time, and several smaller civilizations that had been quietly oppressed by the Council's major powers saw an opportunity, and the Tyrellian Republic declared its support for Earth's cause, followed quickly by the Marthan Free Colonies and the Outrim Alliance, who had waited centuries for someone to challenge the established order. Councillor Prime Ashkara, who led the Thalassian Federation and served as the Council's highest authority, convened an emergency meeting of the surviving Council members, and she argued that they needed to negotiate with humanity before the situation spiraled completely out of control. But many Council members were too proud or too angry to consider backing down to a species they had dismissed as primitive newcomers just weeks earlier. The Krelian Empire mobilized its full military might, and 10,000 warships began converging on human-controlled space with orders to crush the rebellion and restore order. But Captain Cross had anticipated this response, and the human fleet split into smaller battle groups that used the Einstein-Rosen Bridge network to strike at Krelian supply lines and logistics hubs and fuel depots across 24 systems simultaneously. Commander Linda Hayes led a group of stealth ships that had been designed for reconnaissance, but were now equipped with nuclear mines, and she planted them along the major trade routes that supplied the Krelian war machine. And when Krelian supply convoys jumped into those systems, the mines detonated and entire fleets of transport ships were destroyed before they could even detect the threat. And the Krelian advance slowed to a crawl as their forward forces ran out of ammunition and fuel. Major Scott Palmer commanded Marine divisions that specialized in boarding actions, and they used small assault pods to attach to Krelian warships and cut through the hulls with plasma torches and storm inside using close-quarters combat tactics that alien crews had no training to counter, because Council warfare was conducted at long range with energy weapons and sophisticated targeting systems, and the idea of enemy soldiers actually boarding your ship and fighting hand-to-hand was considered barbaric and obsolete. But barbaric and obsolete tactics worked perfectly against crews who had never experienced them, and dozens of Krelian vessels were captured intact with their bewildered crews surrendering rather than facing human soldiers who moved through corridors with rifles and grenades and a ruthless efficiency that terrified beings who had thought war was a civilized activity conducted by professionals following established protocols. The human fleet continued its campaign, and every strike was calculated to demonstrate that humanity understood exactly how to hurt the Council's major powers where it mattered most, and they targeted shipyards and manufacturing centers and communication hubs, and they avoided civilian casualties whenever possible, but made it clear that military and government targets were completely fair game. Counselor Prime Ashkara finally managed to establish a secret communication channel with Ambassador Stone, and she offered to begin negotiations and suggested that perhaps the council had been too hasty in their judgment and that maybe there was room for compromise and understanding. But Stone's response was cold and unambiguous, and he stated that humanity would accept nothing less than full justice for Danny Martinez and recognition that the council's rules did not give anyone the right to murder children. The Kryllian Empire's leaders realized they were facing defeat, and they made a desperate decision that would either end the war in their favor or doom them completely, and they activated the Starbreaker, which was a massive orbital weapons platform that had been built during the last Great War 5 centuries ago, and mothballed since then because its power was considered too dangerous for use in modern conflicts. The Starbreaker was essentially a giant directed energy weapon that could focus enough power to crack a planet's crust and boil its oceans, and the Kryllians positioned it in orbit around New Horizon Station, where 50,000 human colonists still lived and worked, and they sent a message to Captain Cross threatening to destroy the entire station and everyone on it unless the human fleet withdrew immediately and surrendered Counselor Vexthor. Captain Cross faced an impossible decision, because retreating would mean abandoning justice for Danny and teaching the council that they could threaten human civilians whenever they wanted to win, and yet attacking the Starbreaker might trigger its firing sequence and kill thousands of innocent people, including children, who had been Danny's friends and playmates. The command staff debated for hours while the Kryllian deadline approached, and Chief Medical Officer Rebecca Flynn reminded everyone that those colonists included families with young children who had done nothing wrong, and Vice Admiral Chris Walker argued that they could withdraw temporarily and find another way to achieve their objectives. But Captain Cross knew that showing weakness now would undermine everything they had sacrificed for. Claire Martinez had been silent throughout the debate, but now she spoke up and her voice was steady despite the tears running down her face, and she volunteered to lead a suicide mission to destroy the Starbreaker before it could fire. And she explained that she had studied the intelligence reports on the weapon's design and knew that a small fighter carrying antimatter warheads could potentially penetrate its defenses and destroy the reactor core if the pilot was willing to stay with the weapon until impact. Admiral Barnes, who was monitoring the situation from Earth Command, immediately refused to authorize such a mission, and he ordered Captain Cross to find another solution. But Cross understood what Claire's sacrifice would mean to humanity's credibility and to the thousands of parents who had watched Danny die, and he made the hardest decision of his career and allowed Claire to proceed without official authorization, knowing that he would likely face court-martial, but believing that some things were more important than his career. Claire climbed into a modified fighter that had been stripped of everything except engines and weapons, and a cargo bay filled with enough antimatter to vaporize a small moon, and Lieutenant Kevin Ross volunteered to lead an escort squadron to help clear a path through the defensive perimeter, and 8 other pilots immediately joined him because they all understood what Claire was trying to do and why it mattered. The attack wing launched from the Vengeance and accelerated toward the Starbreaker, while Kryllian defenders scrambled to intercept them, and Kevin's squadron engaged the enemy fighters, drawing them away from Claire's approach vector, and one by one, the human pilots sacrificed their ships and lives to keep the defensive forces occupied, and Kevin himself rammed his damaged fighter into a Kryllian destroyer that was moving to block Claire's path, and his final transmission was a simple acknowledgement that some things were worth dying for. Claire's fighter broke through the last defensive line with its hull scorched and systems failing, and she armed the antimatter warheads and locked her course toward the Starbreaker's exposed reactor core, and her hands were steady on the controls as she thought about Danny chasing his ball down that corridor, and she spoke her final words into the communication system, knowing that Captain Cross and the entire fleet were listening. She said to tell everyone that Danny's mother sent her regards, and then her fighter struck the reactor core at full speed, and the antimatter warheads detonated in a flash of light that was visible across 3 star systems, and the Starbreaker tore itself apart in a chain reaction that consumed the entire weapons platform and killed the 5,000 Kryllian personnel aboard, but left New Horizon Station completely untouched, just 2,000 kilometers away. The Kryllian Empire's will to fight died with the Starbreaker because they had gambled everything on that final threat, and lost, and their military commanders realized that they were facing an enemy that possessed not only superior tactics and weapons but also a willingness to sacrifice everything for principles that the Council had long forgotten, and within hours the Krelian High Command transmitted an unconditional surrender. Captain Cross stood on the bridge of the Vengeance looking at the debris field where Claire had died, and he thought about the cost of justice and whether anything they achieved could possibly be worth the sacrifice of people like her and Kevin, and the thousands of others who had died in this brief, terrible war. But then he remembered Danny's face in that video, and he knew that sometimes the cost of not fighting was even higher. The human fleet held position in Council space waiting to see if any other species wanted to continue the conflict. But none did, because the message had been received clearly and completely, and humanity had proven that they were willing to go further and sacrifice more than any civilized species believed possible, and the galaxy had. The 3 months following the Krelian surrender were unlike anything the galaxy had experienced in recorded history, because the old systems and agreements that had governed relations between species for thousands of years were collapsing and new structures were being built from the rubble, and humanity stood at the center of this transformation, not because they sought power, but because they had demonstrated principles that others had forgotten existed. Counselor Prime Ashkara arrived on Earth aboard an unarmed diplomatic vessel, and she came alone without guards or weapons as a gesture of trust, and she met with President Victoria Hayes in Geneva, where the old United Nations building still stood as a monument to humanity's own journey from division to unity, and the two leaders talked for 3 days about what kind of galaxy they wanted to build from the ashes of the Council's failures. Ashkara admitted that the Council had become corrupt and complacent over the centuries, and that species with military power had been making decisions without regard for justice or fairness, and she confessed that many Council members had privately disapproved of Vexthor's actions but had remained silent because speaking up would have cost them political influence and trade agreements, and she asked how humanity had maintained its moral clarity when so many other species had lost theirs. President Hayes explained that humans had not always been moral or just, and that Earth's history was filled with atrocities and injustices that took centuries to acknowledge and address, but that humanity had learned through painful experience that societies which abandoned basic principles of right and wrong eventually destroyed themselves, and that the protection of innocents, especially children, had to be absolute, because once you accepted that some children's lives mattered less than others, you had already lost your humanity. The trial of Counselor Vexithor took place in The Hague, under a combination of human law and newly drafted galactic statutes, and representatives from 200 species attended as observers, and the proceedings were broadcast live across every inhabited world so that billions of beings could watch justice being done in a transparent and fair manner, unlike the closed council sessions where decisions had been made behind sealed doors. Vexthor's defense argued that he had acted according to Krelian law, and that cultural differences meant that what humans considered murder, the Krelians considered legitimate enforcement of security protocols. But the prosecution presented evidence that even under Krelian law, children were supposed to be shown mercy, and that Vexthor had chosen execution as a political statement to intimidate humanity, not because it was legally required. Claire's testimony had been recorded before her death, and the court played the video in which she described Danny as a curious, loving child who had never meant harm to anyone, and who had been excited about making friends with alien children and learning about different cultures, and her voice broke when she talked about his last moments and how he had apologized for picking up his ball and promised to be good if she would just take him home, and there was not a dry eye in the courtroom. When the video ended, the verdict came after 2 weeks of testimony and evidence and deliberation, and Vexthor was found guilty of murder and crimes against sentient beings, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment in a human facility where he would spend the rest of his days understanding that he was subject to the laws he had violated, and that power did not grant immunity from justice. And he was led away screaming that the council would never accept this humiliation. But everyone knew the council he remembered no longer existed. The old Galactic Council was formally dissolved by a vote of its own members, who recognized that the institution had failed in its fundamental purpose of maintaining peace and justice, and in its place arose the Galactic Assembly, which was founded on new principles drafted by a coalition of human and alien legal scholars, and the first law passed unanimously stated, that the protection of children of all species was absolute, and that violations would be met with universal justice regardless of the perpetrator's political or military power. Captain Nathan Cross was promoted to Fleet Admiral and given command of the combined defense forces that would enforce the Assembly's laws, and the ancient human dreadnoughts were not mothballed, but instead became the backbone of a peacekeeping fleet that included ships from dozens of species who wanted to be part of the new order. And Cross accepted the responsibility with full awareness that humanity had become the galaxy's enforcer, not through choice, but through demonstrated willingness to act when others remained silent. Admiral Gregory Barnes retired from active service, and in his final speech before the Assembly, he reflected on how humanity had come to the stars hoping to find friends, but had found politicians and empires instead, and he stated that the Council had mistaken humanity's desire for peace as weakness, and had learned too late that humans possessed the capacity for both great compassion and terrible violence, and that they would always choose compassion when possible, but would never hesitate to embrace violence when protecting innocence. The memorial to Danny Martinez was erected in Geneva, on the grounds of the Assembly's new headquarters, and it showed a bronze statue of a young boy reaching up toward the stars with his robotic dog at his side, and the inscription read simply that Danny Martinez, age 10, had reminded humanity who they were through his innocence and what they could become through his death. And every delegate to the Assembly passed that statue when entering the building, and many stopped to touch the boy's outstretched hand as a reminder of why they were there. Claire Martinez became a legend told in stories across 1,000 worlds, and her personal logs recovered from her fighter's memory core were published as letters to Danny, and the book became the most widely read text in galactic history because it showed a mother's love transformed into determination and sacrifice in species who had never understood human emotion, began to comprehend what drove humanity to fight so fiercely for principles that seemed abstract to those who had forgotten them. The letters described Claire's journey from scientist to soldier, and her struggles with grief and rage, and her ultimate decision to sacrifice herself so that other children would never face what Danny had faced, and the final entry written hours before her attack on the Starbreaker said that she hoped Danny would understand why she had to do this, and that she was not seeking revenge but justice, and that maybe her death would help build a galaxy where all children could chase their toys without fear. The Krillian Empire underwent massive reforms as part of their surrender terms, and their government was restructured to include democratic representation, and their military was reduced and placed under Assembly oversight, and many Krillians especially. The younger generation expressed shame about what had been done in their name, and worked to build bridges with humanity and other species who had suffered under the old imperial system. A young Krillian named Kethvar, who had lost family members in the war, wrote an open letter to humanity that went viral across the galactic network, and in it, he apologized for what his people had done, and acknowledged that Danny's death had been murder, not justice, and he said that the Krillian people needed to learn from humanity that strength without mercy was not strength at all, but tyranny, and that his generation would work to ensure that Krillian culture evolved beyond the brutal traditions that had led to tragedy. New Horizon Station was rebuilt and expanded, and became the headquarters for the Assembly's cultural exchange programs, and human and alien children played together in the gardens under improved security that ensured no child would ever be harmed. For innocent mistakes, and a special area was designated as Danny's Garden, where a tree from Earth grew alongside plants from 100 worlds, and children planted flowers there to honor the boy whose death had changed the galaxy. Ambassador Richard Stone became humanity's chief representative to the Assembly, and he worked tirelessly to build the institutions and procedures that would prevent future atrocities. And he often said that the easy part had been winning the war. But the hard part was winning the peace and making sure that the sacrifices of Claire and Kevin and thousands of others resulted in lasting change, not just a temporary shift in power. The human fleet maintained a constant presence throughout Assembly space, and their ships, painted with Earth's blue and green colors, became symbols of protection and justice, and pirates and criminals learned to fear the sight of a human dreadnought. Because humanity's reputation for ruthless efficiency in combat meant that most conflicts ended with surrender rather than battle, and the galaxy became safer not through fear alone, but through the knowledge that someone was finally willing to enforce the laws that protected the innocent. Lieutenant Kevin Ross was posthumously awarded the Assembly's highest honor for valor, and his family received the medal at a ceremony attended by representatives from 50 species, and his mother gave a speech in which she said that Kevin had always believed that the purpose of military service was not to make war, but to make war unnecessary by standing ready to defend those who could not defend themselves, and that his sacrifice alongside Claire's had proven that some causes were worth dying for. The Tyrellian Republic and other species who had supported Earth during the war formed close alliances with. 20 years had passed since the day that changed the galaxy, and New Horizon Station had grown into a thriving city in space where representatives from over 500 species lived and worked together under laws that protected everyone equally, regardless of their homeworld or the size of their military, and the children who played in Danny's garden had never known a time when justice was optional or when power alone determined right from wrong. The statue of Danny Martinez stood in the center of the garden, and it had been touched by so many hands over the years that the bronze had taken on a golden shine, where millions of fingers had brushed against the boy's outstretched hand, and every child who came to the station learned his story and understood that their safety and freedom had been purchased with the sacrifice of people who believed that some principles were worth any cost. Admiral Nathan Cross was now retired and living quietly on Earth, but he still received visitors from across the galaxy who wanted to thank him or ask his advice or simply shake the hand of the man who had commanded humanity's response to injustice. And he always told them the same thing, which was that he had simply done what any decent person would do when faced with the choice between accepting evil or fighting it, and that the real heroes were people like Claire and Kevin who had given everything. The ancient fleet still patrolled assembly space, but most of the dreadnoughts were now crewed by mixed human and alien personnel, because the assembly had learned that the best way to maintain peace was to give all species a stake in defending. It and young Krillians served alongside humans and Tyrellians and Genkar, and they trained together and ate together and became friends. And the old hatred slowly faded as new generations grew up in a galaxy where cooperation was rewarded more than conquest. Captain Sarah Blake commanded the Vengeance now, and she was part of the generation that had grown up hearing stories about the war, but had never experienced it directly, and she took her responsibility seriously because she understood that the fleet's reputation for swift justice was what prevented conflicts from escalating. And she often walked through the ship's memorial corridor, where the names of Claire Martinez and Kevin Ross and all the others who had died were engraved on walls that glowed with soft blue light. President Victoria Hayes had served 3 terms and then retired to write her memoirs, and in them she reflected on the decision to open Vault 7 and unleash the ancient fleet, and she wrote that it had been the hardest choice of her life, because she knew it would lead to death and destruction, but that allowing Danny's murder to go unanswered would have been worse, because it would have taught humanity that their children's lives were negotiable, and that principle could be abandoned for convenience. The letters to Danny had been translated into over 800 languages and dialects, and it was required reading in schools across assembly space, because educators believed that Claire's words captured something essential about why civilizations needed moral foundations and why laws existed, not to restrict freedom but to protect those who could not protect themselves. And students wrote essays about what they would be willing to sacrifice for justice, and discussed whether Claire's choice had been heroic or tragic or both. Counselor Prime Ashkara was now simply Elder Ashkara, because the title of counselor had been retired along with the old council, and she spent her final years working with human philosophers and legal scholars to document the lessons learned from the tragedy, and she often said that the galaxy owed humanity a debt that could never be repaid, because humans had reminded everyone that civilization meant nothing without conscience, and that progress measured only in technology and territory was not progress at all. The Krillian Empire had become the Krillian Commonwealth, and it was now a federation of democratic systems that had completely reformed their legal codes and cultural practices, and they had established the Danny Martinez Foundation, which worked to promote children's rights and safety throughout their territory. And many Krillians volunteered to serve in the Assembly's child protection agencies as a way of atoning for what their empire had done. Ambassador Richard Stone served as the Assembly's Secretary General for 15 years before retiring, and in his farewell address he said that the Assembly was still imperfect and that injustices still occurred, but that the fundamental difference was that now there were mechanisms for addressing wrongs, and that no species could claim immunity from justice simply because they were powerful, and that this change alone made Danny's death meaningful, even though nothing could make it worthwhile. The Einstein-Rosen bridge network that had given humanity such a strategic advantage during the war was now shared with all assembly members, and it revolutionized travel and trade and communication across the galaxy, and humans worked with alien scientists to improve the technology and build new bridges connecting distant regions. And the galaxy became smaller and more interconnected, and conflicts became harder to sustain when former enemies were trading partners and allies. New Horizons Station hosted the annual Danny Martinez Peace Prize ceremony, where individuals and organizations that worked to protect children and promote justice were recognized and honored, and the prize included a substantial monetary award, and more importantly, the recognition of the entire assembly and recipients came from dozens of species and included teachers and doctors and activists, and even former soldiers who had turned their skills toward protecting rather than destroying. A young human girl named Lucy, who was 10 years old, the same age Danny had been, stood in the garden with her Krillian friend Shenva, who was 8, and Lucy was explaining the story of the statue, while Shenva listened with wide eyes, and when Lucy finished, Shenva asked if humans would ever forgive the Krillians for what happened, and Lucy thought about it carefully before answering. She said that her grandmother had served on the fleet during the war, and had told her that humans did not fight for revenge, but to make sure that what happened to Danny never happened to any child anywhere, and that the point was not punishment, but prevention, and that if the Krillians had truly changed and were working to build a better society, then forgiveness was not only possible but necessary, because carrying hatred forever would mean that Danny's death had created more victims instead of ending victimization. Shenva touched the statue's hand and promised that Krillians would never forget what their empire had done, and would work forever to prove they had learned from it. And Lucy smiled and said that was all anyone could ask, and the two children ran off to play in the gardens while their parents watched from nearby benches and talked about ordinary things like schools and weather and plans for the weekend, because that was the galaxy that Claire and Kevin and thousands of others had died to create. The ancient fleet conducted regular exercises and training operations because Admiral Cross had taught his successors that preparedness prevented war better than any treaty, and that the galaxy needed to remember that justice backed by strength was not aggression but insurance. And new cadets learned the history of the war and studied the tactics and strategies, but more importantly, they learned why the fleet existed and what principles it defended, and that its purpose was not to make humanity powerful but to make the galaxy safe. Fleet Admiral Gregory Barnes died peacefully at age 93, and his funeral was attended by representatives from every assembly species, and the eulogy was delivered by a Krillian admiral who said that Barnes had been a warrior but also a builder, and that he had understood that winning battles meant nothing if you did not also win the peace, and that his legacy was not the ships he commanded or the victories he achieved, but the galaxy he helped create where children of all species could grow up safe. The Vengeance remained the flagship of the fleet, and every captain who commanded it spent time in the memorial corridor reading the names and remembering why those people had died, and Captain Blake often brought her own daughter to the ship to show her the names and explain what they meant, and her daughter asked if she would ever have to fight a war like that. And Blake said she hoped not, but that if the day came when someone threatened innocence, her generation would be ready to respond, just as their grandparents had been. Earth's government maintained Vault 7 as a museum, and school groups toured the facility, seeing the empty docking cradles where the dreadnoughts had slept, and learning about the unification wars and the decision to build weapons before exploring space, and the guides always emphasized that humanity had hoped never to use those ships for war, but had been prepared to do so if necessary, because hope was not the same as naivety, and peace required both goodwill and strength. The galactic economy flourished under the assembly because species that had once competed for resources now cooperated to develop them, and trade agreements were based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation, and the assembly's courts handled disputes fairly and quickly, and businesses knew they could operate across borders without fear that local laws would change arbitrarily, or that powerful species would simply take what they wanted. New species joining the assembly were required to accept the Children's Protection Accord, and species that violated it faced immediate sanctions and intervention, and there had been 3 cases in 20 years where assembly forces had intervened to